On October 17, 1988, at 9:47 p.m., the dispatch center of Glacier National Park in Montana received the last message from Ranger Paul Rivers. He reported movement on the trail in the northern sector. His voice was calm, but something in his tone made the dispatcher tense up. 20 minutes later, Rivers did not respond to the call. A search party sent out to look for him found his radio and flashlight lying neatly on the edge of a 60-foot cliff. And below, on the damp clay soil, the searchers found something that didn't fit any of the reports or instructions, a trail of huge barefoot prints. Each print was about 20 inches long. The tracks led into the thick forest and disappeared. The body of Ranger Paul Rivers was never found. For most tourists, the season in Glacier was over. The golden autumn had given way to the anticipation of winter. Cold winds descended from the mountains, stripping the last leaves from the aspens and poplars. The park emptied, sinking into its natural, wild slumber. It was at this time that the rangers' work became most essential and most lonely. They had to check the trails for damage after the first frosts, monitor the behavior of animals preparing for winter, and make sure that no lost tourists remained in the remote corners of the park. Paul Rivers was precisely the kind of person for whom this job was not just a job, but a calling. A former Marine, he had worked for the National Park Service for nearly 15 years. His colleagues described him as extremely focused, methodical, and physically strong. He knew the northern trails of Glacier like the back of his hand. He was not prone to panic or exaggeration. If Rivers said everything was fine, then everything was fine. If he reported a problem, it was serious. He had a wife and 2 teenage children. He was an ordinary man doing an extraordinary job. On that day, October 17th, his shift was standard. He was patrolling the northern sector of the park, the High Line Trail area, one of the most picturesque but also most dangerous routes. In the summer, it was full of tourists, but in October, the trail, which ran along narrow ledges along the cliffs, was not for the faint of heart. The weather was clear but cold. During the day, the temperature barely rose above freezing. Rivers' radio communications during the day were routine. At 2:30 p.m., he reported a small rockfall in one of the sections, which he cleared himself. At 5 p.m., he gave his standard report that the sector was clear, no tourists were observed, and the weather was unchanged. The last calm conversation took place around 8 p.m. when he discussed a football game scheduled for the weekend with the dispatcher. Nothing foreshadowed trouble. The situation changed at 9:47 p.m. A click on the radio broke the silence. "Dispatcher, this is Rivers." Paul's voice was steady, but he spoke a little slower than usual. "I hear you, Paul. What's going on?" "I have movement on the High Line Trail, near the overlook at the cliff. I can't make out what it is." The dispatcher, a woman named Linda May, later recalled that there was no fear in his voice, just extreme confusion. "Grizzly bear or moose?" she asked, running through the standard options. There was a short pause. All that could be heard on the line was Rivers' breathing and the rustling of the wind. "No, it's big. It's moving. Not like an animal. I'll try to get closer to get a better look." "Paul, be careful," Linda said. "Do you need backup?" "Not yet. I just need to understand what I'm seeing. Over and out." Those were his last words. At 10:10 p.m., when Rivers did not report in for his scheduled check-in, Linda tried to call him. There was no answer. She tried again at 10:15 and 10:30. The radio remained silent. According to protocol, after 30 minutes of no communication with a ranger in a remote area at night, an alarm is sounded. The shift supervisor, an experienced ranger named Carl Becker, immediately organized a search party. 2 pickup trucks with 3 rangers set out for the start of the Highline Trail, where Rivers had left his car. The night was moonless and cold. The light from powerful headlamps illuminated only the tree trunks and the rocky trail leading upward. Paul's Ford Ranger was parked in the lot, locked. Everything inside was fine. This ruled out the possibility of an attack on the car. The group, led by Becker, began climbing the trail on foot. They moved quickly but cautiously. Every rustle made them stop and listen to the silence of the night. The air was still and frosty. After about an hour of climbing, they reached the lookout point Rivers had mentioned. It was a small, rocky outcrop overlooking a gorge about 60 feet deep, and there, on a flat rock, a meter from the edge, they saw it. Paul's Motorola work radio. Next to it lay his heavy Maglite flashlight. It was on, its beam pointing at the ground, at the very edge of the cliff, as if pointing to something below. Becker stepped to the edge. His heart was pounding. He pointed his flashlight down to where a patch of wet, dark clay was visible at the bottom of the ravine, the result of recent rains. What he saw made him freeze. "My God," he whispered into his radio, forgetting to press the transmit button. The others approached and shone their lights down. On the clay surface, visible in the crisscrossing beams of the flashlights, were footprints. These were not bear tracks. There were no claws, and the shape was completely different. They were not human footprints, either. The prints were enormous. 5 toes, a pronounced heel, and the arch of the foot. But the size, each print was at least 20 inches long. They were pressed so deeply into the clay that it suggested the enormous weight of their owner. A chain of prints, right, left, right, led from the foot of the cliff, crossed a small stream, and disappeared into the dense fir forest on the other side of the gorge. There were no other tracks, neither Paul's nor an animal's nearby. There were no signs of a struggle at the top of the cliff either, just the radio and a flashlight pointing down at the impossible tracks. Carl Becker turned on the radio again, this time remembering to press the button. His voice was shaking. "Dispatch, this is Becker. We're here. We found his things, but not him. And something else. You need to send everyone you can to this location. And tell the sheriff to come too. Immediately." The arrival of reinforcements turned the secluded lookout into a center of feverish but subdued activity. Over the next 2 hours, 4 more rangers arrived, along with the Flathead County Sheriff and 2 of his deputies. The night silence was replaced by the crackle of radios, quiet orders, and the light of a dozen flashlights combing every inch of rock and forest. The atmosphere was surreal. These professionals, accustomed to tragedies in the wilderness, falls, bear attacks, frostbite, stood in confusion. What they were facing was unprecedented. First, they cordoned off 2 areas, the upper platform with Rivers' belongings and the area with the footprints below. They were treated as 2 separate but related crime scenes. The sheriff, a man named Jim Brody, personally descended into the ravine with Carl Becker. Brody was a pragmatist to the core, having worked in law enforcement for 25 years. He had seen it all. But standing next to a footprint that was almost twice as long as his size 45 boot, he was silent for a long time. The examination of the footprints was as thorough as field conditions would allow. Each print was photographed from different angles with a measuring tape next to it. One of the sheriff's deputies, who had experience with plaster casts, immediately set to work making them. It was a difficult task. The clay was wet, and extreme care had to be taken. While he worked, Becker and the sheriff studied the chain of footprints. The stride was vast, about 7 feet long, which indicated not only enormous height, but also movement at high speed. The creature had not walked. It had sprinted across the ravine. Above, another deputy examined the radio and flashlight. There were no scratches or dents. The batteries in the flashlight were almost new. This confirmed their initial guess. The items had not been thrown or knocked out of someone's hands in a struggle. They had been placed on the rock. There were no traces of blood, scraps of clothing, or even the characteristic scuff marks from boots that would have been left if a person had been dragged to the edge by force. Everything was clean. Too clean. At dawn, a full-scale search operation began. More than 30 people, rangers, local volunteers, and a rescue team began combing the forest, moving in the direction the tracks led. By that time, the plaster casts had hardened. When they were removed and cleaned, everyone gathered around saw the precise shape of a foot, with 5 toes, no claws, and a pronounced arch, but broad and flat, like that of an animal adapted to walking on rough terrain. It was not a bear. It was not a human wearing fake boots. The weight required to leave such deep impressions would have been impossible for a human to carry. It was estimated that the creature must have weighed at least 800 pounds, if not more. The group following the tracks was faced with a new mystery. The prints were visible for about 400 yards. They led through thick undergrowth, where a human would inevitably have left traces of broken branches and trampled grass. But here, there were almost no such traces, only a few broken branches high up. And then the strangest thing happened. In an area with soft soil covered with a layer of pine needles, the track stopped. They did not reach the rocky ledge or cross over to the stony ground. They disappeared. The searchers combed every inch within 100 yards. Nothing. It was as if the creature that had left them had dissolved into thin air or flown up into the trees, which seemed impossible given its supposed weight. While the search was going on, Carl Becker gave his first statement to the sheriff. He repeated Paul's last words over and over again. The phrase, "moving, not like an animal," now sounded ominous. Paul was the last person who would make something up, Becker said, his face gray with fatigue and shock. If he said that, then he saw something he couldn't identify, something that didn't fit into his 15 years of experience in these woods. He wasn't scared. He was puzzled. He wanted to understand, and that's what killed him. By noon, the news had reached Paul's wife, Sarah Rivers. She refused to believe what had happened. Paul would never have taken an unnecessary risk, she repeated to Sheriff Brody when he arrived at her home. He was a professional. He wouldn't have fallen. If there were something there, he would have reported it. What does disappear mean? People don't disappear. She said that Paul had never mentioned anything strange or unusual about the park. No stories about mysterious creatures or peculiar occurrences. He was a pragmatist who believed only in what he could see and touch. The official investigation reached a dead end within the first 48 hours. They had physical evidence that was impossible to explain, a radio and a flashlight, indicating no struggle, and plaster casts of giant feet belonging to a creature unknown to science. No bodies, no witnesses, no motive. The animal attack theory was ruled out. No known predator leaves such traces and neatly arranges its victims' belongings. The fall theory contradicted all the evidence. That left kidnapping. But by whom? And how? After 3 days, the active search was called off. Heavy snowfall began, covering the mountains with a thick white blanket and hiding any possible clues. Paul Rivers was officially declared missing in the line of duty. Only scant information about the ranger's disappearance and the discovery of his belongings was leaked to the press. No mention was made of any traces. The plaster casts were sent from the sheriff's office to the state crime lab, and from there, through unofficial channels, they were requested for examination by federal agencies. A few weeks later, Sheriff Brody received a brief report. It stated that the casts submitted do not match any known species of North American fauna, and that the origin of the prints cannot be determined. In a private telephone conversation, one of Brody's acquaintances at the FBI advised him to forget about these casts and close the case as an accident. For those who were there that night, it was tantamount to an order to deny reality. They had seen the tracks. They had held the heavy plaster casts in their hands. For them, Paul Rivers' disappearance was no longer just a tragedy. It was proof that something unnameable lived in the vast, wild expanses of their home state, something powerful, intelligent, and completely beyond human understanding, and that something now knew it had been seen. The investigation was officially suspended, but for Carl Becker and a few other rangers, it was just beginning. They began to see the forest with different eyes. The winter of 1988 and 1989 was long and snowy. The snow buried all traces and all hopes. The Paul Rivers case was officially classified as inactive. A memorial plaque with his name appeared at the park headquarters. Another victim of the wilderness, according to the official version. For the administration, for the newspapers, for the public, the story was over. But not for those who were there. Carl Becker couldn't find peace. The image of the clean, empty crime scene and the impossible tracks in the ravine haunted him. He began his unofficial investigation, spending his weekends and evenings in the park archives and local libraries. He wasn't looking for mysticism. He was looking for patterns. He spent hours poring over old incident reports, ranger logs from the past 50 years, and local newspaper clippings. He looked for any mention of strange occurrences in the northern sector. Most of the entries were routine, but gradually, among the hundreds of pages, he began to find bits of information. A report from 1976, 2 tourists who had left the trail in a panic said that for several hours they had been followed by something huge and silent that moved parallel to them in the forest, remaining out of sight. Their story was dismissed as nervous exhaustion and a figment of their imagination. An entry in a hunter's diary, dated 1962, he found a deer torn to pieces, but the tracks around it did not belong to a bear or a cougar. He described them as devil's footprints and left the area forever. A newspaper article from 1938 about a missing prospector. His tent and all his belongings were untouched, the campfire was extinguished, and he had disappeared without a trace. Each case was easily explained or dismissed as fiction. But when taken together, they formed a disturbing mosaic. All the incidents occurred in the same relatively small sector of the park. They all described something significant, silent, and elusive. Becker realized that whatever Paul Rivers had encountered had been living in these woods for decades, if not longer. It was a master of disguise, a predator that knew its territory so well that its existence remained a mystery. The breakthrough came in the spring of 2000, almost a year and a half after Paul's disappearance. A biologist from the University of Montana who was studying moose migration set up several automatic camera traps in a remote area about 10 miles from where Rivers had disappeared. The cameras were equipped with motion sensors and infrared flashes for nighttime photography. Several months later, the scientists collected the cameras to analyze the data. One memory card contained unusual photos taken at night. At first, a deer looks away, frightened, then a blurred frame. Something huge has passed close by. You can see a shoulder and back with dark fur and powerful muscles. The proportions are like those of a biped. The next frame is black. The camera had been torn from the tree and smashed. The biologist didn't understand what it was. He showed it to his colleagues, but they couldn't explain it. Through acquaintances, the photo reached Becker. He saw it as proof. This was the creature from the tracks and stories. Becker gathered everything, reports about Paul, casts of the tracks, old cases, and photos. He went to the director of the Park Service. He explained the facts. Paul's death was not an accident. The casts had been hidden. There had been many similar incidents over the years, and he showed the photos. He requested that experts inspect the area and that the danger be acknowledged. The director listened, but refused. He said that such things would cause panic. The park would be closed, and people would lose their jobs. The photo was blurry. The casts proved nothing, and the incidents were old stories. He advised Becker not to get involved and to submit the materials to the archives. Becker realized that the system did not want to acknowledge the problem. It was easier to keep quiet than to investigate. He gave up. Paul's case was never solved. Becker's photos and papers were lost in the archives. The story became a local legend, told to newcomers. Most people think it's fiction, but Becker, who retired and moved away, knew the truth. So did a few other people who had been there. They understood that something unknown lived in the vast park with its mountains. Unfortunately, Ranger's body was never found, and the mystery remains unsolved.